Hello folks, welcome to another Tuesday night book club recording that we're sharing out a little bit later than usual. Sorry for that. I normally try to get it out a few days after the Tuesday night, but this is the weekend and other stuff going on, but better late than never. It is with Aoife Lenox, who gave a summary of the book Flourish by Dr. Martin Seligman, and it has been well received, as all of them have so far. So I hope you enjoy it. Just a couple of quick ones. We have 3 more TNBKs lined up with 3 summaries coming up over the next, I guess that's probably 4 weeks, and looking forward to them. If you're interested in becoming a summarizer or somebody that would come on and give a summary of a book that has had an impact on you, get in touch with me or Dec O'Connell. Rob at robofthegreen.ie is the best way to do that. Love to hear from you. And if there's other ideas you have for Tuesday Night Book Club, let us know. Just another comment, 1 or 2 people said the show comes out very raw without any music beforehand, and just interested to see what your thoughts are. It is pretty much just the unedited version of the book club, and the conversation that happens afterwards a little bit different to everything else that comes out on the Rob of the Green channel, but interested to know if that works or if you have any feedback on how we could improve it. So there you go, take it away, Aoife, and it starts just a minute or so into the conversation. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks again for listening and getting your free book summary courtesy of Aoife Lenox this time round.
An easier book for myself because I suppose at times it's a little bit psychology heavy, even though I'm really interested in it, and there's loads of practical tools. So if you're interested in positive psychology, if you're interested in coaching, there's absolutely loads in it. And I suppose I was looking to maybe add some of these tools to my own coaching practice, and just really deepen my knowledge of positive psychology. So I had read the book about a year ago, but like a lot of books, I'd done all my highlighting and my note-taking, and then I put it nicely back on the shelf, and that was the end of that. And I couldn't tell you what I actually took from it. So I said I'd volunteer for this and set myself a goal and actually properly, sit down, and I really had to study it really to kind of get a good grasp of it. So hopefully I can kind of give you a sort of good overview and perspective of it. So if you're not familiar, Martin Seligman, the author of it, is credited with being I suppose one of the founding fathers of positive psychology. So he became the president of the American Psychological Association back in, I think it was 1998. And he wanted a different track for psychology. So he says that psychology before that had been very much centered around misery and depression, basically is what he says, and everything that's wrong with people. So he wanted to take an alternative approach and really try to start to look at, if we look at what's right with people and right with situations and I suppose create a new pathway for psychology, and that was the beginnings of positive psychology. So he wrote a book in 2002, and it was called Authentic Happiness. But this book is it's kind of a build on to that, because he said his understanding of happiness, or what makes us happy, has changed since then. So when he wrote the book in 2002, they looked at 3 different areas that he says could make us happy. And they were positive emotion, engagement, and meaning. So how much positive emotion you're feeling in your life, how engaged you are in your work, you're really absorbed in your work or life or whatever you're doing. And do you feel a purpose and a value in what you're doing? He felt that and realized, I suppose, between 2002 and 2011, when this book was written, that really it was kind of short-sighted. It didn't take into account 2 more important areas. One is relationships, and the other is accomplishments. Because he said, if you think about anything good that has ever happened in your life, it's probably you weren't alone. You were probably with people or doing something with people. So he said having positive relationships in your life is a really, really important component of well-being. And I should say that he doesn't like to use the term happiness anymore. It's more well-being, which is a more rounded approach. So he starts off the book with that kind of journey, I suppose, from understanding happiness and what it is to well-being theory. And they're the 5 elements. And he uses the acronym PERMA. So P for positive emotion, E for engagement, R for relationships, N for meaning, and A for accomplishments. And I suppose what I like about having that sort of an acronym to work from is that it's broken down into components that he says you can measure each of them. So you can kind of identify for yourself, where are you feeling on a 0 to 10 in terms of each of those, and try to, I suppose, build up each of them. Like recently I kind of realized I was like, it was all kind of work focused and everything that was going on. And I just needed a bit more of maybe the relationship part of things. So I kind of just reached out to some friends I hadn't talked to. So I think it's a very easy tool for people and coaches and anybody to work with and to kind of use as a baseline. So he says that when we can increase all of the elements of those or increase each of those, then we're flourishing. And that's really, he says, what should be our goal in life, to be flourishing and to build up those components of well-being. So the first chapter is really covering kind of that growth from happiness theory to well-being theory, which is what he says we're at now. Now I looked up and actually they've added on a H to that PERMA as well, which he doesn't have in the book, and the H is for health as well. So the second one then is the second chapter is creating your happiness and positive psychology exercises that work. And many of them you're probably familiar with. The first one is the gratitude visit. So you think of somebody that may have said something or done something in your life and you maybe that made a difference and you never thanked them properly. So you write out a gratitude letter around 300 words and then you deliver it to them. And he says you not only get to relive the positive emotion in that when writing that gratitude letter and thinking about what happened, but you also get to nurture that relationship too with the other person. He says that how do we get lasting change in our life? Is it like our waistline, that it might go in and out? And he talks about dieting and all the money people spend on dieting, and then you go back to stage one again, So he says, how do you really bring about lasting change? And I think what he's trying to do in the book is he's trying to say, if you use this kind of acronym of PERMA, if you use all the tools of positive psychology, it really can transform your thinking. And it's a practice that you put into place for your own life. So he says, we have to recognize external circumstances can't change us. We have to change ourselves. He references the lotto winners research, that they found people who won the lotto that, they're really happy for a period of time and then generally they go back to, where they were at in their life already. He talks about signature strengths exercises. And I do this with my clients as well. So, it's viacharacter.org if you're not familiar with it. So it's the values and action character assessment. So they actually designed this when he was starting this whole positive psychology movement, and it's free for anybody to use. And he says sometimes they'll do research, and I think it's still it could still be up there on the site. So they research different areas at different times. So for example, even right now, I don't know if they do COVID or whatever, it could be up on the site. And they use that then towards their research for positive psychology. So a few other things they talk about positive psychotherapy and the different types of tools that you can use in those sessions. And again, they're very practical and useful for everybody. So one exercise is you write a paragraph or write an introductory paragraph about you at your best time, right? So when you were doing your best. And I was talking to somebody the other day who's going to be doing some work with 6th class children. And I was suggesting this to her because I thought it would be a nice exercise even for children. You could just write about a day when you were at your best and try to get them to pull out the positives. So she said, what if they wrote about they were kayaking? I said, that's great. They can think about, did they persevere to get back to the shore, and help them pull out the different strengths there. He suggests that we focus on satisfiers and not maximizers. And I think this is a huge one for people who are high achievers and trying to find it's good enough. And you don't always have to be striving for everything to be, at the maximum and just being satisfied. Forgiveness letter for people who are holding a lot of anger and trauma. Total maximizer, yeah, me too, Aoife. the gratitude letter I mentioned. So 3 doors closed. I thought this was really good for at the moment for people who might have lost a job, lost a business, or, going through trauma really with everything that's going on. And, if you're, it's easy to pick out the 3 doors closed, but what's the one door that might be open to you? So what might have, what opportunity could you take, I suppose, and trying to reframe it. He also suggests that aside from your own character strengths, that you identify character strengths of your family. So you could do like a family tree, whoever's in your family, and try to help identify the strengths of those. So I thought that was pretty good too. And then the other one is savoring techniques. So I suppose trying to slow down and savor the positive things that happen to us, and even reflecting on them, and just slowing down a little bit and just savoring those good moments. So that chapter was really a lot of different of his tools, which I think are very, very practical, very doable. But I think you have to put them into practice and you have to stick with them. His chapter 3 is around drugs and therapy. And he just says that depression is the most costly disease in the world. And he quotes, figures from the US and how much money is spent on drugs and therapy trying to deal with depression, for example. And he says, once you stop taking those drugs, then you're back to square one again. So again, it's back to like, how do you bring that change, I suppose, that continuous change into your life? So another tool that he brings in here, and this was the only thing I found challenging about the book, he kind of goes off on different tangents at different times. So you really had to kind of get your head around, okay, what exactly is he talking about here? But he brings another tool, and it's called active constructive response. So, when you, I suppose, encounter a situation and how you respond to it. So let's say somebody tells you that they've got a new job. Actively, constructively responding to it would be actively engage with the person, showing emotion, and then constructively that, you're asking really positive questions, and that's great, and tell me about it, rather than saying, oh, that sounds like a lot of stress, or a lot of, or being passive and really not showing much emotion at all. So he says, really practicing that kind of response technique is really good. And he had a whole piece then about they've identified that how you celebrate with somebody is more indicative of how positive the relationship is than how you fight. And so that's why if you can bring that active constructive tool into practice, then you're really positively responding to somebody all of the time. And that would be indicative of a good relationship. He said, and if you do any courses in positive psychology now, they'll say, positive psychology initially was very much focused on all the good stuff and trying to bring out the good stuff, and it still is, but it's now there's real recognition that you have to be able to deal with negative emotions as well. So he says it's not just about putting the happy face over things, it's about dealing with the negative emotions. So he shares 2 interesting stories that I thought were good. One is about how they train snipers, and the other is how they train fighter pilots. So snipers generally will need to be they're about 24 hours getting into position before they take a shot. And then they could be another 36 hours before they actually take the shot. So by the time they take that shot, which requires total precision, they're totally exhausted. So the way they train these snipers is they continually put them into these situations where they're absolutely exhausted. And he says it's the same for fighter pilots. They literally have them in the plane until they're about to hit the ground, and then they go up again. So it's putting ourselves, I suppose, into situations where, dealing with uncertainty, learning to be uncomfortable, and learning to work through that, rather than trying to say everything has to be happy and avoid the difficult situations. So his chapter 4 then talks about the development of the Masters in Applied Positive Psychology, which is what they run out in University of Pennsylvania. And if you follow any of I suppose the students and teachers in that program online, you'll recognize the names like John Gottman, Barb Fredrickson, Caroline Adams Miller, I think is another one. So they're all on LinkedIn and you can follow their stuff. But he talked about Barb Fredrickson's work with companies. And what they did was they actually transcribed every meeting in companies over a certain period of time, and they measured it for positivity versus negativity. And what they said was they called it a Losado ratio, and you needed 2.9 to 1 positive to negative Losado ratio for a company to be flourishing. Now, I did a course in positive psychology in UCC, and he disputed that and said that wasn't accurate any longer, but that's what's in the book anyway. And he says you need a 2.9 to 1 Losado rating. And he also mentions sports teams. And I have a 17-year-old who likes to gamble a little bit on sports teams. So I was telling him this story that what they did was they transcribed all of the comments from sports coaches. And what they found was the more optimistic the sports coach, the more successful the team. So I suppose he's trying to get across, the power in our language, really, and using positive language. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about social media and the type of sort of comments that you see on it sometimes. And he actually talks about the power of social media in promoting well-being later on as well. And just, I suppose, reframing our language all the time, to be aware and really positive focused. So then he brings in John Gottman again, who's done work on relationships and marriage. And according to them, you need a 5 to 1 positive to negative ratio in order to have a good marriage. I think if you're at a 2.9 to 1, you're heading towards divorce. If you're at a 1 to 3, it's just a disaster basically. So, but I think we can just take the message that the more positive, the better. He tells a story about the assistant to the CEO of PricewaterhouseCoopers, who came over and trained with them and learned about positive psychology and wanted to bring all those tools and techniques back to PricewaterhouseCoopers. And so they've been trying to do that and trying to build up their own Losado ratio as well in just creating a more positive, I suppose, work environment. He also talks about appreciative inquiry, which is, when you respond, I suppose, positively to somebody and you build on what they say rather than trying to contradict somebody, which is what we have a tendency to do sometimes. He also talks about, and this is Caroline Adams Miller actually, goal setting theory and happiness. It's the idea that we think we will be happy when we have whatever, but her research shows very clearly that happier people are more likely to reach their goals. So it goes back to the kind of well-being theory, I suppose, at the start, that, if you focus on your well-being and focus on that aspect of it, you're actually more likely then to reach your goals and to achieve what you want to achieve. So he goes on then to chapter 5, and he talks about teaching well-being to young people. And I think this is really, really important. And he says that depression is 10 times higher in young people than it was, I think, 50 years ago is what he says. And he says, teaching about well-being skills is not just good for the individual, but it actually improves creativity. It broadens their attention span, and so has lots of educational benefits as well, aside from just the individual. So he talks about going out to Australia. He was asked to go to Geelong Grammar School, which seemingly is where Prince Charles would have spent some time as well. And what they did was they brought positive psychology to absolutely every aspect of that school. So when the English teacher is teaching about King Lear, they're looking for character strengths of the characters within King Lear. The art teacher is teaching appreciation of beauty. In geography, they don't learn about droughts and famines, and they learn about what countries are happiest in the world, or they learn about well-being in different countries, or it all has a positive sort of a spin on it, I suppose. And what he says was that helped them to develop a common language. So everybody was sort of working from the same base and the same language. They also taught them about the ABC theory. So, it's not what happens to us as in the adversity. It's really our beliefs. So B for beliefs. So, if we can change our beliefs about what happens to us, that can help change the consequence. And I just thought, how powerful for young people to be able to learn those skills. And so no matter what happens, if you can, I suppose, find inner control yourself, it's really empowering. This is actually where he brings in then about Facebook. And again, this is 2011, so Facebook was probably the primary one back then. But they did some research on terms used on Facebook and what was going on in the world. So they used laid off, and they searched for the amount of times that laid off was used on Facebook, and then the amount of layoffs that were happening around the world. And they found that there was a lot of similarities between the two. So again, I suppose just the power of language used on social media, and how that, I suppose, tells the story of what's going on in our world. And I just saw somebody on Facebook last night, his daughter had set up a kindness club. And so he said everything that he posts from now to the end of the year on Facebook will be around the area of kindness. So, it's interesting to just think that, I suppose, the power that it could have. So in chapter 6, then, he looks at, he calls it the ways to flourish, but really I think all of the previous tools are relevant for that as well. But he talks about grit. And if you've read Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, she actually applied for that master's in applied positive psychology, and she got it. And the reason he said that she got in is because in her application letter, she suggested that students who don't do well in school, that really it's their own personal responsibility. And he said that, we often blame their background, conditions, the school, whatever. So he said it was really enlightening to see somebody saying, wow, these students have to take personal responsibility. So when he's talking about grit, he's talking about, I suppose, ownership and this idea of being responsible, and that you have a free will to control, right, what happens to you. And he gives a formula for achievement, and he says achievement equals skill multiplied by effort. So, and I was thinking of Niamh and the book that we did 2 weeks ago, Creating Space, because Niamh is all about productivity. So when he talks about skill, he talks about we need to speed up part of what we do. So you speed up the pieces that you can do pretty easily, and then you slow down for the parts like decision making, planning functions, whatever. So I thought that fit in nicely because, Nia's work is all about, I suppose, productivity and increasing efficiency in certain areas. But then her book was about creating space, which was for slowing down and in terms of making decisions and the bigger picture sort of stuff. So he kind of brought that in there as well. But it's so achievement equals skill multiplied by effort. So it's how much effort, and it's taking the responsibility for how much effort you put into things to make things happen. And yes, chapter 7. So he talks about the army, actually. So he goes on to talk about the army globally and politics, and how well-being can come into that. So I thought the piece on the army was actually really interesting. And the army approached him and wanted to bring positive psychology tools into the US Army. So they wanted their soldiers to be psychologically fit and not just physically fit, because obviously soldiers that go into combat and come back from combat, huge issues with post-traumatic stress disorder, and really just very hard for them to function both when they're out there and when they go home. So they designed a global assessment tool. And so they basically assessed every single member of the US Army, and they then assigned them to training. So depending on their results, they'd either go with the basic training or the advanced training. And that training then was continuous, but it would include modules, like 4 modules would be emotional, social, spiritual, and family. So the family one was interesting because he said that the cohort of soldiers that were in the US Army, this was 2011 again, were the first ones to have Wi-Fi. So they were the first ones to actually be in contact with home while they were out in these combat environments. So, they were still parenting kids, they were in relationships, they were dealing with issues at home, and then they were carrying all of that, back literally onto the battlefield. So they did an awful lot of work about developing trust. They gave them one exercise, which was, I suppose, to try not to, I think it was called best, simply putting things in perspective. So it was like best case, worst case, most likely case. And so we gave the example of a soldier who can't reach his spouse or her spouse or whatever. And when you're out there, if you can't reach your spouse for a while, you might think worst case scenario, they've left me, they've gone off and had an affair. Best case, they're so lonely over me, they're talking to their friends about me. And most likely they're probably gone out for a carton of milk, So trying to help the individuals, I suppose, to put things in perspective, to step back from all these different situations, and then just learn to parent from afar and dealing with isolation. So then they had a social module. They said loneliness is actually a huge issue in the US Army, because even though you're among all these people for a long time, learning how to build positive and constructive relationships was actually harder than you think. They brought in the spiritual module because they wanted their soldiers to have, I suppose, to answer to a higher purpose, and so that morals and values would be really important to them. And he gives an example of a massacre that happened. I forget where it was, but it was really an appalling massacre, and two generals were involved in it and just stood by and let it happen, and nobody spoke up about it. So they felt that the spiritual piece was very, very important. And then the emotional as well. So some of the tools that were mentioned earlier, like in terms of being able to step back and manage your reactions and actively, constructively respond to people. He also talked about post-traumatic growth. So he said in West Point cadets, 90% of them know about post-traumatic stress disorder, but only 10% of them know about post-traumatic growth. And what they have found is that when people go through traumatic events and strengths, that it actually builds resilience, and that they're actually much stronger because of it when they come out. So trying, when soldiers, go back and they feel they have post-traumatic stress disorder, that it doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy, that they don't feel, well, I'm doomed and that's it now and I need medication and whatever, but trying to help them reframe it to say that, I'm actually stronger because of this, and to support them going through it. So creating a new narrative really is what he's saying around that post-traumatic issues. And he says that happiness is contagious. And, they have proven that it leads to optimal performance. So it's not just about well-being, I suppose, is another goal as well in terms of success and failure, and particularly in a army and combat situation. Obviously, that's really, really important. So his second last chapter is to do with the biology of optimism. So they looked at cardiovascular diseases, they looked at infectious diseases, and they looked at cancer. The cancer research seemed to be unclear at the moment, but the cardiovascular disease, over a period of 8 to 10 years, they had a cohort of people who had cardiovascular disease, and they measured them for their levels of optimism and pessimism. And at the end of, I think it was 8 years, the number of people who died in the pessimistic category far outweighed the people who were optimistic. And they ran a number of studies like that over many, many years. And so he wasn't suggesting that optimism could prevent, but it can certainly help to deal with cardiovascular disease. So they then did a study on infectious diseases, which, going through a pandemic right now, was kind of interesting, because what they did was they infected people with rhinovirus, which is just the typical cold, kept them in quarantine for 6 days, and then they measured to see who was most likely to get a cold and whose cold lasted the longest. And the way they measured it was based on the mucus production. So they weighed the snotty tissues, is what he said in the book. And they found that the people who experienced the most positive emotions had the shortest colds and were less likely to have a cold. And the way they were able to measure it was for a protein, interleukin 6, I think it was called. So when you experience positive emotions, you produce this particular protein, and that's how they were able to assess it. So I thought that was very interesting. And as I say, the cancer research was the verdict was kind of out. He talks a lot then about learned helplessness and experiments that they had done on rats back in the 1960s. And so when people, well, in that case, it was the rats, but then they later with people, when people feel that they have no escape, they kind of become helpless and take on the victim mentality, I suppose. So he had done that research back in the 60s, but now that he was working in positive psychology, he said, why can't we have learned optimism? And why isn't it something that we can just develop? And he said that having hope was a really important part of that. So helping people to see hope through what they're going, and then they can learn to be optimistic. And then his last piece is about kind of globally. And he talks about, how over the past 50 years, everything has increased except for well-being. So our house size, number of cars, the amount of clothes we have, just absolutely everything. Our income levels have increased, but well-being has not increased. And as I mentioned earlier, rates of depression have risen tenfold. So he says that in countries where GDP is very prosperous, it's less related to well-being. So in a country where things are, we have a good standard of living and all our basics are taken care of, it's less linked to our well-being, right? So well-being tends to kind of drop down. But in countries where GDP is lower, and I suppose they're still struggling to get basics, food, housing, whatever, their well-being seems to improve when those factors are satisfied, if that kind of makes sense. And he ends the book really with saying that, we all have an individual responsibility to promote our own well-being. But then we also have the responsibility to promote the well-being of other people around us, and just how it could lift the whole world, I suppose, that if everybody took on that responsibility. And he mentions that he was writing this book in 2010. He said, it wasn't long after the financial crash. And in the University of Pennsylvania, they have the Wharton School of Business. And he said, we're sending out the financiers of the world, and a lot of them have huge responsibility for the big corporations. And so they were trying to figure out whether, should they be teaching more classes on ethics and values, and how are we going to get people responsible in the business world. And he says, really, it's as simple as well-being, and that if each and every person took that responsibility, and then if our goal in business wasn't just profit, but it was profit and PERMA, he says, which is, the acronym for well-being, that the world would be a different place. And I think his last line is something like, let's say yes to well-being, So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour of positive psychology. But as I say, like there's loads of nuggets in it. I definitely found it transformative reading it the second time round, and definitely makes me, I suppose, more aware in terms of my own well-being, how to measure it and that of others. And I just think it breaks it down. Actually, that was the other thing he said. He said, well-being is like the weather. It's a construct. And so weather isn't a thing in itself, but when you break it down into the rain and the wind, and you can measure the different components, then you can do something about it, or you can, it helps you to understand it. So he says well-being is like that. You can measure it. And if we want public policy and anything to change at governmental level, we have to be able to measure it, or it's not going to be changed. And he talks about, there is a UK government minister responsible for positive psychology, I think, in education. And I know, I think it is that New Zealand has a happiness minister or something like that, or I think a few countries have been trying to bring that in as well. So it's slowly, I suppose, permeating business and policy and whatever. So so that's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions if I can, but that was
No, that was magic, Aoife. Thanks a million. Some really good stuff there. Like it's kind of enlightening. Like, everybody talks about happiness and chasing happiness, yet there's a couple of like really simple exercises backed by research that proves that can help your happiness or your well-being. My own curiosity is like, why do you think people are maybe, have a bit of an aversion to maybe stepping into using these techniques and to embracing positive psychology? Because I think in the wider sphere, positive psychology still has a bit of a bad rep.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually he says as well, coaching, because coaching still, sometimes some people think it's a bit, he says it lacks the scientific evidence. So he says when you combine coaching with positive psychology, that positive psychology is actually the backbone that coaching needs, is what he says. So why are some people, is it because we have to step back and take the time, and it's a little bit uncomfortable maybe, and it goes back to that responsibility? Is it a bit easier to blame outside circumstances, sometimes?
Yeah, no, I'd agree. Like, I mean, it's something that's staring us in the face. Here's something that practically and scientifically improves your happiness. Yes, we won't go near it. We won't embrace it.
Yeah, like if we could say, right, my positive emotion today is a 5, so then what am I going to do to bring it up to a 7 tomorrow? And take that responsibility to do it. Yeah,
really good. Anybody else have any comments just on the?
Yeah, I do. And it's not necessarily a question for you, Aoife. It's more maybe discussion for the floor. But what you said about how we've increased in all areas of life, we're earning more money, bigger houses, bigger TVs, all that kind of stuff. And yet our well-being is still maybe at the same level or slightly lower than what it has been before. And I'd love to get a discussion going on what people think. And I know I'm definitely prone to this, it's greed and it's keeping up with the Joneses, and you see these things and you think that you want them. And it's more about, less about experiences, more about the things that you can acquire and that sort of stuff. So I just wanted to start a discussion about that and see what people think.
Yeah, and I can actually,
I suppose,
comment on that too, because he said, I think the US and Britain are less satisfied. There's a few other countries that are very dissatisfied, and Russia is extremely dissatisfied. So I actually looked up the happiness index, see where Ireland is. So we're 19th in the world in terms of happy countries. Yeah. And the UK and the US are kind of similar. Yeah.
Does anyone have any thoughts on, I suppose, how to address it, what to do? Because it is, people want more cars, they want better cars, they want bigger TVs, they want nicer holidays, all of this kind of stuff. And where is it getting us?
Yeah, from my perspective, Aoife, I think it's a great question. I think we were all kind of forced to slow down with the lockdown. The way Aoife was describing PERMA there, that's actually what got us through it. Like, we had to create our own positive emotions. We had to find things that would engage us. Like, relationships became more and more important, trying to find a bit of meaning and purpose throughout the day, and then accomplishment. So I'd say there was never more garden sheds painted in those couple of months than ever before. So we kind of had a glimpse into, well, what does a life through PERMA actually look like? But I think you can see now, certainly in the last couple of weeks, that there's been this real sort of race to get back to the way things were. And I think that's kind of classic conditioning, isn't it? That we're okay to try something for 6 to 8 weeks, but then we'll snap back to where we were before. And it is exactly that, Aoife. It's back onto the treadmill, back onto keeping up with the Joneses, going after the things that we think will make us happy rather than things actually that, as Aoife described there, that happiness is the inside job. So it's a really interesting dichotomy that people think they'll be happy when they achieve rather than focusing inwards. And maybe it's comfort.
Is it slightly exacerbated then by the likes of social media? So you see what other people are doing, or at least other people are putting up their highlight reel of this is how fantastic my life is, when it's 1 or 2 minutes, if even, out of their entire day, when they could have been miserable all day, or they're just trying to boast about what it is that they have, or whatever it might be. I don't know.
Yeah, but welcome any input to that.
I don't know about the social media part of things, Aoife. I know that there's a lot of research out there saying social media plays a part in that, but I think a lot of it has to do with a working environment. I just think that demands on employees before lockdown, during lockdown, now after lockdown is huge. And it's not even necessarily the people who are ambitious and want the bigger jobs. I think there's a huge amount of pressure on lots of people at the moment and all the time from corporations and from management structure. And even though that is giving us the materialistic goods, in terms of the cars and the big TVs, the offside of that is that the demands that's being made on us in a work environment.
I think you make a good point, and I know of a few people as well, and working in HR, and they're just they're doing 12-hour days since March, and really, yeah, you'd wonder what's it all for, you know. And I think the organisations, I talked to somebody today actually she was been with a big multinational for many years, and she left because they were moving country, and she said it was amazing. She's like, she realised she was just a little pawn, and just, you know, she was like, they were closing out her email, they were just shooing her out the door after all the years, you know. So it's, yeah, I think, and I mentioned PricewaterhouseCoopers actually, and I'd love to, I didn't get a chance, but I will go back and look and see, like, they were trying to bring in this whole positive psychology initiative into Pricewaterhouse. So I wonder if they did succeed, and if anything has changed, or if any companies have really adopted this. He says that things that worked in the army usually do go into mainstream and they go into business. So I don't know, you know. Actually, Tony Heisch, I think I'm saying that correct, the CEO of Zappos. Has anybody read that book, Delivering Happiness? That's a great book too, and that's an easy read. That would have been easier to do actually for the book club in hindsight. And he talks about how he created the culture at his company. So he actually he's written the review here on the front. So like that's a good example of a company that really uses it. And actually, I think it's Zappos. Once you go through the induction period, they actually offer you a number of $1,000.
Yeah.
If you think, is that Zappos? Yeah, to leave. Yeah,
$5,000 or something
like that.
2 or 3 months, and they say if you don't fit in here, please take $5,000 and leave. Because it's not worth their time to have people who don't fit in with the culture to stay on in the business and cost them money through training and whatever else.
Yeah.
It's an amazing approach.
Had a couple of thoughts. Somebody said to me very, very recently, he was talking about a colleague, former friend of his, a former colleague and current friend, who runs a business now that he's retired. And he works, he said he works about 35 hours a week. It's a part-time job. And I kind of looked at him and I said, 35 hours a week it's not a part-time job. And the person I was talking to said, well, I normally work 70, so 35 hours a week is part-time to me. And I'm looking at him going, you're setting policy, like you're a HR senior HR leader, and you're saying that 70 hours a week is normal. That
or acceptable.
And then anything less is not acceptable. Exactly. The other thing that occurred to me, anybody ever read Jeffrey Byrd? He wrote a couple of books with Peter Pfeffer. But the most interesting quote that I've ever read, and I think it's so applicable to this, when he's talking about empowerment, he defines empowerment badly implemented as the co-opted repression of dissent. So essentially, that if you want to reduce the amount of complaints and the amount of problems that people have within your organization, tell them they're empowered and tell them to go fix it themselves. And it's and he says that sometimes when he goes into companies as a consultant, that's what he's finding. He's finding that people are being told they have the power when they don't, and that therefore empowerment is the co-opted repression of dissent. And I can't help but feel that in companies that would be run like somebody, by somebody who thinks that 70 hours a week is normal, the positive psychology has exactly the same potential. I've given you the tools to be happy, fire on ahead. Why are you not happy working 80 hours a week? So I'd be quite wary about it from that point of view, I have to say.
Well, I mean, my thoughts on that, 70 hours a week, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And isn't it the law of diminishing returns? Like once you go above 35 hours or something, like you're not really adding that much value to the organization.
Oh, completely.
And if he's a very senior person, then he should be leading by example and showing people how to be more efficient or how to get their work done in a normal working hours, basically.
Yeah. Instead, he's sitting in his glass office looking out at people who can't leave because he's still there.
Presenteeism.
There we go. So work expands to fit the time allowed.
Yes.
It can be cultural, because I know like in Scandinavian countries that working late is actually deemed as a negative. It's developmental. Like, are you okay? Is there something that you're not getting? Like, are you near past 5? So it's really interesting. It is that cultural piece that infiltrates, and it's obviously country by country, but company by company as well. And it's kind of that cultural thing of what's rewarded here. So is it sitting at your desk doing your online shopping, reading the paper and staying till 8 o'clock? And is that seen as being productive? So it's whatever.
I think it is.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I think to Aoife's point, it's really up to the company to set the tone, and the leaders need to set the tone. And then people who are coaches, people who work in HR need to show the research that's been done around the cost that our lack of well-being is having with stress and illnesses, etc. So there is costs to businesses. I'm not sure they're listening to that data to the extent that we certainly would like them to. But I think it's up to us to really influence that as much as we can, and then leadership to set the tone. I've heard of some managers, you can create email time when you want your emails to go out. And they've started to do that so that they're not sending out emails at any time after 5 o'clock, just to show their employees that, we switch off at 5 o'clock and they have them go out then at 9 o'clock the next morning. And I just thought that was a really practical and positive way for a leader to show their team what is normal in our company, which is culture shaping. And that's what's so important.
Yeah. Especially in work from home environments where you can't actually see what time people are working at.
Exactly.
So it's entirely reasonable to have flexibility. But if I'm the most senior person and my flexibility includes that I don't work in the afternoon, I work in the evening, and I'm getting annoyed because I'm not getting an answer to my email at 9 p.m. That's a really bad thing. And I think that having those timed emails is a much, much cleverer approach to that.
Yeah.
It's funny though, we're all probably that people-centered focus and approach. But if you bring in somebody else here now who just commercial, money, bottom line, got to get it done, I have no doubt that there would be a robust debate as to say, look, we've no time for this flourishing stuff. We've no time for this.
Absolutely. There's
work to get done, and we need to do it. And they'll be completely immovable in that view. So, there's always going to be a tension between people versus profit. Really,
I totally agree with what you're saying, Declan. I totally agree. There are those people who focus very much on the money and the profit. Now, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell did an experiment over a good number of years where he looked at investing in companies that were people focused versus the general stock exchange or something like that.
Yeah.
And the companies who focused on their people and putting people first and creating better cultures and work environments outperformed the general stock market by a good factor. And I don't know off the top of my head what it was, but he did look at that. So there are stats that say it is worth investing in people, but I totally get what you mean. There's some people who just wouldn't even entertain that thought. Like, you should be working your 80 hours a week, and what are we paying you for, and all that kind of shit.
That's where analytics come in. And that's where all businesses, but especially the world of HR, has to move towards analytics and proving the worth, as Sarah said.
Yeah. I think one of the issues that was that an awful lot of that commercial piece is being driven by tasks rather than skill or knowledge or intellectual property or anything else. So if you have somebody testing COVID samples in a lab and they're working 80 hours a week, they're going to get through twice as many samples as somebody working 40 hours a week. Because it's absolutely mechanical what they're doing. And I think an awful lot of the commercial stuff it's almost back to that really old-fashioned piece rate kind of thing, that the longer people are working, the more that they're actually achieving. So when we're talking about analytics, I think we need to be really careful of what we're actually describing and how we're saying it will matter.
Yeah, that's a great point, Maura. Great point.
Yeah, because I've had this debate about the 4-day week and how to transition over to a 4-day week. But you make an absolutely valid point, and there are other roles, other role types where, like you say, the longer you're working, or like for customer service roles, for being available, and for sales roles where it's based around volume rather than kind of inherent skill or knowledge and that sort of thing. We could probably debate that all night.
Yeah. And it goes back to the question then, do we all have a responsibility then as a society to, mind each other, I suppose. But I know that argument over profit versus that fluffy stuff, will be hard to fight.
Aoife, does that go back to what you were saying about taking personal responsibility? Now, I've had so many conversations in my life where people are miserable in their jobs, but they're not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
Like I was miserable in my job and I left.
Yeah.
I took personal responsibility and I got out of there. And that's more than once, and I didn't have anything else to go to necessarily. But there's so many other people who are saying, oh no, sure, it's grand. Oh no, sure, I'll just wait a little while. Or, oh no, well, they're just stuck in their own misery, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really it. And even if your boss is in the office and not leaving, and that's the culture and the standard there, if you take the personal responsibility and you say, well, I know I've done my 100% here, I've done my work, so my well-being is important. So I'm, but I know that's not always as easy to do.
It's not. I think it also depends on people's responsibilities. I mean, where I live, if I was working where I lived and I had responsibilities and a mortgage and a car loan, there's very little other employment opportunities. If I was to leave, I could be unemployed for a very long time. So it's people's circumstances, inertia, all of these things combine together to keep people in their misery. So I think that for me, that comes back to a different aspect of positive psychology, which is looking at the misery that you're in. You'll only ever see the misery. Whereas if you look at, you actually do the pros and cons, why you're staying, where you're staying, and what you're getting out of it, then it might change how you're looking at your misery.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so personal responsibility doesn't mean you have to leave the job, but you do what you can to change the situation.
Yeah. Or even just look at it differently. Okay, so I'm doing this job. I don't like it. I don't like my boss, but it's 10 minutes from home. I get enough to pay my mortgage. I can leave at 6 o'clock and get home, and I can pick up my kids. I can do all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So therefore, let me stick a smile on my face and go in the morning and just do what I need to do in order to have all of the advantages that I'm having.
Yeah,
exactly.
And sometimes it's, it's about changing our focus a little bit. It's not necessarily about changing the situation that we're in.
Yeah. True.
If I really loved your summary, thank you. I'd say you put a lot of work into today's
Like I said halfway through, I was like, oh my God, what have I taken on?
There was so much that jumped out at me, and but one thing that I hadn't really thought of that really jumped out at me was the people who come back from war and they have post-traumatic stress. Rather, I forget the stat you gave, but we're all very familiar with that. We all think of the post-traumatic stress, but actually, if you change that thinking to thinking about, well, what did I learn? My resilience, I survived. That's very powerful. And I know the common theme was about training your thoughts, but that's one of the most powerful things I'm taking away from this evening. That thought process, because it's so mainstream about people suffering from post-traumatic stress. What about if you switched your thinking there? How powerful that would be.
Exactly. And actually, I read Vicky Phelan's novel not too long ago, and I didn't realize she had so many other challenges in her life before getting cervical cancer and the fight that she took on and everything. But I was thinking of her as I was reading. I was like, wow, I wonder if that all built up a resilience in her so that she was able to cope and able to take on what she took on, so it's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, you see particularly people involved in social activism as a result of personal trauma that they themselves have suffered, whether it's child sexual abuse or rape or sexual assault or whatever, and they're doing the most incredible activism on behalf of other victims. And the strength it must take to do that, and the resilience as a result of it is a really, I see a direct link between that post-traumatic stress and the post-traumatic growth that they have within themselves to give to other people. That, is just extraordinary.
Yeah.
Good point, yeah.
This one's just to the hour now, so Aoife, that was absolutely magic. I suppose my own selfish reason for being involved in this is to try to take one thing from every single book and to apply it over the next week. So, I'm going to look at some of those practical applications, some of those exercises, and even just try to experience them for myself, I think, over the next 2 weeks. So, Aoife, I'll definitely report back and see.
Great.
Thanks a million for the rundown. We do have a space open in 2 weeks' time if anybody wants to put their hand up. Don't need to do it here and now, but if you want to contact myself and Rob, we'll get going again. But loved the review, loved the debate afterwards, and thanks again for everybody for signing up.
Thanks, guys.
In 2 weeks'
Thanks, Aoife. That was great.
Thanks, Aoife.
Thanks, Dr. Brown.
Thanks, Declan. Thanks, Aoife.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.